The hallway outside courtroom 4B smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and I had been staring at the same water stain on the ceiling for 11 minutes when Nora Winters sat down beside me like she wasn't supposed to. She had a legal pad pressed against her chest, the same one she carried into every meeting, and her heels made almost no sound on the marble, which told me she'd been standing outside that door longer than she wanted anyone to know. Across the hall, Preston Ashford checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes, the way a man checks a watch when he already believes he's going to win. Renee sat beside him with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale, and she wasn't looking at either of us. I hadn't slept. My tie was borrowed from Jamie Torres, who told me it was lucky, though he couldn't say lucky for what. Somewhere behind those double doors, a judge named Marion Hale was deciding whether I got to keep raising my own daughter, and I had spent 6 weeks learning exactly how little that decision would have to do with whether I loved her. Somewhere under that borrowed tie, my heart was doing something closer to Morse code than a heartbeat. And I remember thinking, absurdly, that I hoped whoever mopped courthouse hallways for a living took some pride in it, because the shine on that floor was the only detail in the whole building that looked like somebody still cared. I thought about Lily. She was 7 years old, and she believed I was in a boring meeting, because that's what you tell a kid when you can't tell her the truth, which is that 4 adults and a stack of paper were deciding whether she'd keep sleeping in her own bed with her elephant nightlight, or start splitting her nights between 2 houses that didn't feel like home yet. I thought about the drawing taped to our refrigerator that said "M.Y. Dad" in crayon letters, the D backward, perfect anyway. Nora didn't look at me right away. She looked at the doors first, like she was making sure they'd stay shut a little longer. And when she finally turned toward me, her voice came out so quiet I had to lean in to catch it. "I can't do this anymore," she said. I didn't understand what she meant, not fully, not yet. My first thought, God help me, was that she meant she couldn't sit next to me, that some rule had been broken just by her being there. What? She didn't answer the question I'd asked. She answered a different one I hadn't known to ask yet. "When they call us back in, don't sign anything you haven't read twice," she said. "And when it's my turn to speak, listen, really listen." Then the bailiff opened the door and called the docket number, and she was on her feet before I could ask what any of that meant, straightening her blazer like she was arming herself for something. And I sat there for one more second, not knowing that the next 20 minutes were going to undo 6 weeks of my life in the best possible way. 7 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday that started exactly like every other Tuesday, I was standing in my kitchen at 5:40 in the morning, attempting to braid my daughter's hair with the seriousness of a man diffusing something dangerous. I've been a paramedic for 9 years, most of them out of Station 7 on the east side of Asheville, and I can start an IV in a moving ambulance in a thunderstorm, but I cannot braid hair, and Lily has known this for a while. "You're doing the crossy part wrong," she told me, not unkindly, the way a surgeon corrects an intern. I told her the crossy part was my specialty. She told me, very seriously, that I was lying. Behind us, the coffee maker did its slow, complaining gurgle, and the radio played something neither of us was actually listening to. And for those few minutes, before the knock came, my life still looked like the only kind of life I understood. Small, and a little tired, and entirely mine. The knock came at 6:02. I remember the time because I checked the microwave clock on my way to the door, assuming it was Mrs. Abernathy from next door, who sometimes forgot her key at the exact moment she needed it most. It wasn't Mrs. Abernathy. It was a man in a windbreaker holding a clipboard, who asked if I was Caleb Doyle, and when I said yes, he handed me an envelope and told me to have a good day, in the tone of someone who says that to everybody regardless of what's inside. Lily asked what it was from the hallway, still working one sock onto her foot. I told her it was nothing, which was the first time I had ever lied to her about something that mattered, And it would not be the last time that year, though I didn't know that yet. I didn't open it in front of her. I set it on the passenger seat and drove her to school first, because some part of me already understood that whatever was inside that envelope was about to rearrange the next several months of my life, and I wanted 5 more ordinary minutes before it did. Lily talked the whole way about a girl named Bethany, who swore she'd seen a real fox in her backyard. I said that sounded incredible. She said it was, in fact, incredible, and made me promise to look up fox facts before pickup. I promised. Then I dropped her at the yellow curb outside Cortland Elementary, watched her backpack bounce as she ran to catch up with Bethany, and sat in my parked car for a long time before I finally tore the envelope open. Renee left 3 years ago. Not dramatically, not in the middle of the night, just a slow leaving that started with longer trips to see her sister in Charlotte and ended one October evening with her sitting across from me, saying she didn't know who she was anymore and needed to find out somewhere that wasn't this apartment. I didn't fight her on it, not because I didn't love her, but because you can't argue someone into wanting a life she's already decided she doesn't want. Lily stayed with me. That was never really a question back then, because back then Renee didn't want full custody either. She wanted visits, holidays, a version of motherhood she could carry in a suitcase. What she had now, according to the papers shaking slightly in my hands, was a new husband named Preston Ashford, a house with a name instead of a street number, and a petition asking the court to grant her full physical custody of our daughter, citing my occupation's unpredictable hours, my modest income, and what the document called a pattern of instability in the home. I read the word instability 4 times. My apartment had exactly 1 leak in the bathroom, and I had already fixed it twice. I didn't tell Jamie Torres about the petition until we were 40 minutes into a night shift, parked outside a gas station on Marymount Avenue, waiting for a call that hadn't come in yet. Jamie's been my partner on the truck for 6 years, and he has a way of listening that doesn't require you to look at him, which made it easier to say out loud. When I finished, he didn't offer sympathy, which I appreciated, because sympathy right then would have cracked something open I needed to keep closed until the shift ended. Instead, he asked how much the lawyer they'd hired probably cost, did some quiet math out loud about Ashford Development's last 2 building permits, and said, flatly, that money doesn't make someone a better parent, it just makes them a more convincing liar in a room that respects paperwork. Then he brought up the night I'd carried a woman down 4 flights during a power outage because the elevator wouldn't come, how I'd talked to her the whole way down about her garden so she wouldn't think about her spine, and asked whether that sounded like the resume of an unstable man. It didn't fix anything. It didn't need to. What it did was remind me, for about 90 seconds in a gas station parking lot, that somebody besides Lily still saw exactly who I was, which turned out to be a thing I needed more of in the coming weeks than I understood at the time. That evening, after my shift ended, I drove to Gordon Pierce's office above a bike shop on Lexington Avenue, because Gordon owed me a favor from a night 4 years back when I kept his father breathing until the ambulance no longer needed to be the one I was driving. He read the petition twice, the way you read a diagnosis you already suspected. Preston Ashford, he said, tapping the name with 1 finger, is trying to get a seat on the county planning board, and there's a very tidy story that goes along with that campaign. Wealthy developer rescues a struggling single mother, gives her daughter the stable home she deserved. You don't fit into that story, Caleb. That's not really a legal problem. That's a marketing problem, and they're planning to solve it in a courtroom. He told me the hearing was set for the 2nd week of December, 6 weeks out, and that Ashford's firm had assigned 2 attorneys to the case, a senior partner named Arthur Sloan, who mostly showed up to intimidate, and a junior associate who'd be doing the actual work. Her name, he said, checking his notes, was Nora Winters, and she had a reputation for being thorough in a way that occasionally worked against the client paying for it. I didn't think much of that sentence at the time, I filed it away as lawyer talk, the kind of thing Gordon said to make himself feel better about being outgunned. I had no idea it would turn out to be the only sentence in that whole conversation that actually mattered. Nora came to my apartment on a Saturday morning 9 days after the petition was filed, and she'd clocked the whole room before I'd even finished opening the door, the way people who do this for a living always seem to. She asked, before she assumed anything, could she see Lily's bedroom? Could she look at my work schedule for the last 6 months? Did I have documentation of the childcare arrangement I used during overnight shifts? She wrote everything down in handwriting too neat to belong to someone in a hurry. And she asked her questions in a voice that gave away nothing, not warmth, not suspicion, just the flat, careful tone of someone building a record she could stand behind later. I answered everything, because Gordon told me to answer everything, and somewhere around the 9th question my patience, which has never been my strongest asset, started fraying at the edges. "You've asked me 3 different ways whether I leave her alone," I said. "The answer is still no." She didn't apologize for the repetition. "I'm not trying to trap you, Mr. Doyle. I'm trying to make sure the version of events I build is one I can actually defend." That stopped me for a second, because it wasn't the answer of someone who'd already decided I was the villain in this. She moved through the apartment cataloging evidence, which she was, and I followed her with my arms crossed, which probably didn't help my case, until she stopped in the kitchen doorway and went quiet in a different way. Taped to the refrigerator, at exactly the height a 7-year-old can reach on her tiptoes, was a drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands under a crayon sun, "M.Y. Dad" written above one of them in backward letters. Beside it hung a laminated schedule in my own handwriting, color-coded, showing exactly which nights Mrs. Abernathy covered when my shifts ran long, and which nights were mine, no matter what. Nora looked at it longer than a crayon drawing probably deserved from a woman being paid to find reasons I shouldn't keep my daughter. She didn't write anything down about it. She just looked, and then she looked at me, and for one unguarded second, something crossed her face that had nothing to do with the legal pad at all. Then it was gone, and she thanked me for my time, and she left, and I stood in my kitchen for a long time, wondering exactly what I'd just seen cross a stranger's face in my own home. The deposition happened 2 weeks later in a conference room with a view of nothing, and Renee cried through most of it. Not the kind of crying that comes from lying, I don't think, but the kind that comes from reciting a story someone else wrote for you, and hating yourself a little more with every sentence. She said I'd missed Lily's school play in October. That part was true. I'd been running a call on Tunnel Road, a 16-year-old who'd wrapped his car around a guardrail, and I told the room I'd make that same choice again in a heartbeat. She said my apartment was too small for a growing girl. She said my hours meant Lily spent too many nights with a babysitter instead of a parent. Every time her voice wavered, Preston, sitting behind her, shifted forward in his seat just enough that she straightened up and kept going, like a hand on the small of her back that nobody else in the room could see but everybody understood. I held it together for 2 hours. I held it together right up until the recess, when I stepped into the hallway to breathe, and Preston followed me out alone and told me, in the calm voice of a man who has never once been afraid of anything, that this would go a lot easier for everyone if I just signed the settlement his lawyers had drafted and stopped, in his words, dragging a good woman through the mud for a lifestyle I clearly couldn't sustain. I told him I wasn't the one who'd filed the paperwork. He smiled at that and said something about how Lily would thank him someday, once she was old enough to understand what stability actually looked like, and that a man in scrubs who missed school plays for strangers wasn't exactly a father figure to build a childhood around. Something in my chest went white and loud. I put my hand flat against his chest and shoved him 2 steps back into a water fountain hard enough that a woman 2 offices down opened her door to see what the noise was. Nobody got hurt. Nothing was said that couldn't be walked back. But Nora came out of the conference room in time to see the tail end of it, and I watched her face do the math, and I understood, standing there with my hand still curled from the shove, that I had just handed Preston Ashford the best evidence he'd get all month, and I had handed it to him myself. The following Saturday was a scheduled exchange, the kind that happens in a grocery store parking lot at 4 in the afternoon, because neither side trusts the other enough to do it anywhere quieter. Preston sent his driver instead of coming himself, a stone-faced man who idled the car 11 minutes late, and then told me, through a cracked window, that Mr. Ashford's schedule didn't really allow for waiting around. Lily stood beside me the entire 11 minutes, clutching her overnight bag like it might get taken from her too. And when the car finally pulled up, she looked at me with a question in her face. She was too polite, even at 7, to ask out loud. I knelt down to her height on the cold pavement. "You'll call me before bed," I told her. "Every single time, no matter what." She nodded and got in the car, and I stood in that parking lot until the taillights disappeared, feeling like I'd handed a piece of myself through a window to a man who wouldn't even bother driving it himself. Gordon documented the 11 minutes. He documented the driver's comment. He said it wouldn't move the needle much on its own, but that a pattern of small carelessness sometimes told a judge more than one big dramatic failure ever could. And I held on to that, the way you hold on to anything when you don't have much else. Lily asked about Nora exactly once, on a drive back from the grocery store, apropos of nothing, the way 7-year-olds ask the questions that matter most. Is the notepad lady on our side or their side? She wanted to know, staring out the window at a line of maple trees going orange. I told her the notepad lady was doing her job, and that sometimes a person's job and a person's heart don't agree with each other right away. Lily thought about that for the length of 2 stoplights. "That sounds hard," she finally said, with the flat, matter-of-fact sympathy kids offer before they've learned to complicate it with anything else. And then she asked if we could get the cereal with the toucan on the box, and just like that we were back to being a father and a daughter in a grocery store parking lot, instead of 2 people waiting to find out whether to stay that way. Nora didn't file anything about the parking lot fountain that week, which surprised Gordon more than it surprised me, though neither of us said why out loud. What she did instead, we learned much later, was drive to Cortland Elementary on her own time and ask Lily's teacher, a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Patterson, to describe the father she'd met at conferences and pickup lines for 2 straight years. Mrs. Patterson told her that Caleb Doyle was the parent who showed up in scrubs, still smelling faintly of a hospital because he'd come straight from a shift. The parent who once brought cupcakes for the whole class because Lily had been embarrassed her birthday fell on a weekend. The parent who never once, in 2 years, missed a scheduled conference, including one he attended on a phone propped against a steering wheel in an ambulance bay between calls. Nora also knocked on Mrs. Abernathy's door, 2 apartments down from mine, expecting, I think, to find some version of the neglect Preston's team had promised her. Instead, she got an 81-year-old woman who talked for 40 minutes about the night I ran 6 blocks in uniform, straight off an overnight shift, because Mrs. Abernathy's ride to Lily's school play had a flat tire, and I refused to let my daughter walk onto that stage without one familiar face in the crowd. Nora asked, at some point, whether Mrs. Abernathy was ever worried leaving Lily with me. Mrs. Abernathy reportedly laughed so hard she had to sit down. None of that reached me directly. What reached me was smaller and stranger. Nora called my cell one evening, ostensibly to confirm a date for the home study, and after we'd covered the actual business there was a pause on the line that went on long enough I almost hung up, thinking the call had dropped. "Mr. Doyle," she said finally. "Nothing. Never mind." Neither of us said anything else for a few seconds. I didn't ask. She didn't offer. We just stayed on the line, breathing into 2 different rooms in 2 different lives, until she said goodnight and hung up, and I stood in my kitchen, holding a dead phone, aware that something had shifted without either of us naming it. The home study visit that mattered most almost didn't happen because I got called into an extra shift that afternoon and didn't make it back until nearly 7, exhausted, still in uniform, to find Nora sitting in her car outside my building with the patience of someone who had decided, for reasons she probably couldn't have explained to Arthur Sloane, to wait rather than reschedule and log another missed appointment against me. Mrs. Abernathy had Lily inside, and by the time Nora and I walked in together, oddly quiet with each other, Lily was already supposed to be asleep. She wasn't. I heard her before I saw her, a thin, scared sound coming from behind her door, and when I pushed it open, she was sitting up, clutching her elephant nightlight against her chest, cheeks wet, saying the thing that had apparently been sitting in her for weeks without either of us noticing. Am I going to have to live somewhere I don't know my own room? I sat on the edge of her bed. I didn't lie to her because I'd already used up my one lie about the envelope and didn't want to spend another. I told her grown-ups were figuring some things out, and that no matter what got figured out, I would always find her, every single time, in every version of every house. She asked if that was a promise. I told her it was the only kind of promise I knew how to make. She fell back asleep with her hand fisted in the collar of my shirt, and it took almost 10 minutes to work my fingers loose without waking her. When I came back out to the living room, Nora was standing by the window instead of sitting where I'd left her, and she didn't turn around right away. "I'm supposed to be building a case that says she isn't safe with you," she said, more to the glass than to me. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She didn't either. We just stood there, 10 feet apart, in a small living room that smelled like antiseptic and cheap coffee, while somewhere down the hall, a 7-year-old slept holding on to a promise instead of a stuffed animal. And for the first time since the papers arrived, I let myself wonder if the person across the room from me might end up being the reason any of this turned out all right. The affidavit showed up in Discovery 11 days before the hearing. 3 typed pages from a woman named Diane Foss, who described herself as a concerned neighbor and claimed she'd twice seen Lily walking to the corner store alone after dark while I worked. I had never heard the name Diane Foss in my life. Neither, it turned out, had anyone on our block, which Gordon confirmed within an afternoon of knocking on doors. What took longer to confirm, and what Nora found first, was that the affidavit had been formatted using a template she recognized from a dozen commercial leases that year. One used exclusively by Ashford Development's internal counsel, right down to a header font nobody outside that office used. She brought it into Arthur Sloane's office on a Tuesday afternoon and set it on his desk without saying anything at first, just watching his face while he read it. He read it slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers together, and asked her what exactly she thought the problem was. She told him the formatting matched their own client's internal documents, which meant somebody on their side of this case had likely written that statement themselves and handed it to a woman who'd never met the child in it. Sloane was quiet for a moment, and then he told her that Ashford Development accounted for roughly 11% of the firm's annual revenue, and that her job was to win cases, not referee the moral character of the people paying for them. "Clean it up if it bothers you," he said. "Don't blow up a client relationship over formatting." Nora didn't argue with him in that office. She told me later she didn't trust her own voice enough to argue, that she needed to be somewhere else before she said something she couldn't walk back. What she did instead was go home that night and call Diane Foss herself, off the record, one woman to another, and ask her, gently, how she'd come to write 3 pages about a child she'd apparently never met. Diane cried within the first 2 minutes. She worked for Preston as a receptionist. She'd been told the affidavit was a formality, that everyone already knew the father worked too much anyway, that it wasn't really lying if it was probably true. She'd signed it because her manager asked her to, and because she needed the job, and because nobody had ever taught her that a signature on the wrong piece of paper could end up deciding where a little girl slept at night. Nora didn't tell me any of this before the hearing. What she told me, the only thing she told me, was the sentence in the hallway, the one that had been sitting unfinished in my chest for 2 weeks by the time I finally understood it. The night before the ruling, she sat at her kitchen table with the Foss affidavit, Diane's recorded admission on her phone, and a resignation letter she'd drafted 3 times and deleted twice. She told me later that she spent that night rereading every witness statement in the file twice, Mrs. Patterson's, Mrs. Abernathy's, even her own notes from the day she stood in my kitchen and saw a crayon drawing taped at a 7-year-old's eye level, and that somewhere around 2 in the morning she stopped seeing a case file and started seeing an actual family that a false piece of paper was about to break apart for good. Renee called her that same night, panicked, saying Preston had told her the affidavit was just extra insurance and she hadn't known where it actually came from, and that she wanted, more than anything, for her daughter to stop being afraid of her own bedroom. Nora told her the truth would come out one way or another the next morning, and that she could either be standing on the right side of it or not. And then she hung up and didn't sleep, and neither, it turned out, did I, 12 miles away, rehearsing a version of tomorrow where I lost everything, and a version where I didn't, unable to decide which one to believe. Which brings me back to the hallway, to the water stain on the ceiling, and the borrowed tie, and the 11 minutes I'd spent not breathing properly. To the moment Nora sat down beside me and told me she couldn't do this anymore, and then walked through those doors before I could ask what she meant. Inside, Judge Hale took her seat with the unhurried calm of someone who had clearly read every page in the file twice, and Arthur Sloane stood first, smooth as a man reading a menu, and began summarizing what he called overwhelming evidence of an unstable home environment. He got exactly 40 seconds into it before Nora rose from her own chair at her own table against her own client and said she needed to bring something to the court's attention before he continued. Sloane's head turned so fast I heard his collar creak. "Your Honor," Nora said, and her voice, which had been flat and careful in my kitchen weeks earlier, was steady in a completely different way now, the way a person sounds when they've already decided the cost is worth it. An affidavit submitted as Exhibit C in this matter was formatted using a template proprietary to my firm's client, Ashford Development, and signed by an individual who has since confirmed, on recording, that she has never met the minor child in question and was directed to sign the statement by Mr. Ashford's office. The room did the thing rooms do when the floor tilts without warning. Preston was on his feet, saying this was outrageous, that Nora had clearly compromised herself, and Sloane was hissing something at her I couldn't hear and didn't need to. Then, before her own attorney could stop her, Renee stood up on shaking legs and told the judge, in a voice that kept breaking and rebuilding itself mid-sentence, that she'd had her doubts about that affidavit from the day it appeared in a folder Preston handed her, and that she was ashamed it had taken someone else's courage to make her say so out loud. Judge Hale didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She said she'd be reviewing the recording personally, that fabricating evidence in a custody proceeding was a matter she took as seriously as anything that came before her, and that she'd expect sworn statements from both Ms. Foss and Mr. Ashford before the week was out. Then she looked at me, the first time all morning, and asked if I had anything I wanted to add. I thought about Lily's fingers fisted in my collar. I thought about a fox that may or may not have existed in Bethany's backyard. "Just that I've never once left her alone," I said, "and I never will." It wasn't eloquent. It was true, which mattered more. The ruling came down 8 days later in writing because Judge Hale said she wanted the record to be precise rather than fast. Full physical custody remained with me. Renee retained scheduled visitation, supervised for the first 90 days, not as punishment exactly, the judge wrote, but as a period in which she could show the court, and more importantly her daughter, what her own choices looked like when nobody else was making them for her. The matter of the fabricated affidavit was referred separately for review, and I heard, months later, secondhand, that Preston Ashford's planning board nomination quietly dissolved sometime that winter, though nobody ever printed a reason in the paper. Nora resigned from Sloane's firm before the ink on the ruling was even dry. She told me she didn't wait to be pushed, because she'd already decided, sitting at her kitchen table with Diane Foss crying on the other end of a phone line, that she didn't want to build any more of her life on paperwork she couldn't defend out loud. She spent that spring doing something she once told me she never thought she'd have the patience for, taking family law cases for clients who couldn't afford Sloane's kind of hourly rate, working out of a small shared office 2 blocks from Gordon's. When I asked her once whether she missed the version of her career she'd walked away from, she said the only thing she missed was not knowing yet what she was capable of. Renee came to see Lily 2 Saturdays later, alone, without Preston, and sat on our living room floor for 2 hours putting together a jigsaw puzzle of a lighthouse. And when she left, she hugged me for exactly 1 second longer than either of us expected. "Thank you for not making it easy for me to be a coward," she said, which is not the kind of thing people usually say out loud, but she said it, and I believed her. Nora and I didn't speak again for almost a month after the ruling, on purpose, because she said the case needed to be fully legally finished before she let herself think about the thing she'd been quietly not thinking about since a living room window in November. When she finally called, it was a Tuesday, and she asked, in a voice that had none of its old courtroom flatness left in it, whether Lily still wanted to know about foxes because she'd found an entire documentary about them and didn't know what to do with that information except offer it to the person who'd first told her the story. We had dinner that Friday, the 3 of us, at a diner with a jukebox that only half worked, and Lily interrogated Nora with the seriousness of a much older attorney, asking whether she'd ever lost a case, whether she'd been scared in the hallway, whether she liked foxes more than elephants. At one point she asked, without any wind-up at all, whether grown-ups were allowed to be scared of things too, and Nora set down her coffee and told her that she'd been more scared in that hallway outside courtroom 4B than she'd ever been in 9 years of practicing law, and that being scared and doing the right thing anyway were basically the same muscle, just used at different times. Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone filing it away for later use, then went back to rearranging her fries into the shape of a fox. Some nights now, months later, Nora stays late enough that she's still there in the morning, and Lily has stopped asking whether the schedule might change again, because a kid can tell, faster than any judge can, when a house has stopped holding its breath. If you've ever sat outside a courtroom waiting to hear whether you're allowed to keep loving someone the law says is yours, you already know there's no way to explain the particular quiet of that hallway to somebody who hasn't lived it, and you know exactly what it means when someone finally breaks that quiet by choosing you at real cost to themselves when they didn't have to. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing someone they loved to a decision that wasn't theirs to make. I don't think that anymore. I think the worst thing is watching someone you love get erased by a story someone else wrote about them. And the best thing, the thing I didn't have a name for until I watched it happen twice in one hallway, is a person deciding, on their own, that the story isn't worth telling if it isn't true. Last Sunday, Lily stood on a kitchen chair to reach the top of the refrigerator, where the crayon drawing of 2 stick figures still hangs, a little faded now, and added a 3rd figure beside it, taller, with a small yellow rectangle tucked under one stick arm. "There," she said, stepping down and wiping her hands on her jeans like she'd just finished actual construction work. "Now it's right." Nora looked at it for a long moment, the same way she had the very first time, except this time she didn't have to pretend it wasn't hers to feel something about. "Yeah," she said quietly, "now it's right."